Why don't we welcome everyone into, this is the first ever Zoom meeting that we've had with the Amherst Irish Association. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, okay. We've been having our event series been running now for what, 6 years, 7 years? Yeah. And like the rest of the world, we've had to make this change. We started, in case anyone has not heard about the origins of the Amherst Irish Association, we started on the back of the Blarney blowout of 2014, I think it was, when there was really some unfortunate scenes that we witnessed here in Amherst. And we decided to have a positive reaction to that. And out of all of that grew the Amherst Irish Association, and we've had these event series going on for years and years. And now we had, in the spring, like everything else, we had to cancel everything. And we were thinking, like I suppose most people were thinking, that this would be a short-term, we didn't know, it was an indeterminate amount of time. But now we're all coming to terms with the idea that this is where we live now. This is how it is. So we're resuming. And thank you all for checking in with us today. As Tim has mentioned, we're recording these. They'll be available on YouTube after the fact. And with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to Ida to introduce Malcolm for our speaker today.
Okay, Gurmagud, Sam, thank you. And fall to everybody, welcome. Hey Chip, I just see you joined us there, and Marianne down there. Hi and there. There's Kate to the left. Fall to Roiv Galair and Jean, Bill and Kathleen, Shonacon, and who will be there? Liz. Allow me, if you would, before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Malcolm Sen, allow me to pay tribute to the Amherst Irish team. Sam, Tim, Annie, Jonathan and Amanda, and a special word of thanks to Tim Goodhind, who set up the Zoom and keeps in touch with our membership. Remember, all of us volunteer our time in order to facilitate an opportunity for our community to explore aspects of Irish culture, diaspora and society. So Malcolm. Malcolm is Assistant Professor in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is the editor of the Cambridge History of Irish Literature and the Environment, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press in 2021, and co-editor of Race in Irish Literature and Culture, also from Cambridge University Press, forthcoming in 2022. His monograph on natural disasters, contemporary Irish literature, climate change, will be published by Syracuse University Press next year. Malcolm is also the secretary of the American Conference for Irish Studies, a busy man by all accounts. Malcolm and his family have been supporters of our association for some time now. Catherine O'Callaghan, his spouse, presented in our last series on the modern Irish novel, a superb event. And their children, Afra and Anushka, have even danced a few Irish steps during our Tea and Tune segment in the old days, when we could meet in person, which we will do again. Achanish, Inuv, here today, Malcolm will speak about race in Irish culture and literature. Please join me in welcoming Malcolm, our lad from Calcutta.
Well, thank you very much, Ida, and thank you for having me here. This is great to be able to share my thoughts on this with you all. You know, I've been doing so many of these Zoom sessions because all my classes now are on Zoom. And I'm well aware that people can find it extremely tiring at times, So I was trying to think of, which way to do this, and maybe, I mean, I have quite a lot to say, but we're going to try and kind of skip through quite a few slides as well. So thank you for having me here. I think this is an important conversation, especially given our contemporary moment today, and also given the fact that you have been talking about biracial multiracial Irish identities, I think, through other talks, like Dan Kennedy's talk, I think, was on something like that as well, right? So kind of bear with me while I try to kind of give you some kind of a historical perspective, and maybe we can have quite a bit of Q&A as well on these, because I'm going to brush over multiple details here. So, if you think about the phrases, that have kind of defined the stories of Ireland in the 21st century, you will find that these phrases are all crisis-ridden. Phrases such as financial crisis, debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis, banking crisis, and economic crisis, as we know, regularly featured in newspaper columns after the demise of the Celtic Tiger in 2008. But there are other crises that emerge in public discourse at the same time in Ireland, that point to a more kind of a global destabilization. And examples of those would be the asylum crisis, the refugee crisis, and of course, my main subject of area, which is area of study, which is the climate crisis. Even in post-austerity, economically resurgent Ireland of recent years, the phrase housing crisis resounds in public discourse all the time. And to that, we can, of course, add the Brexit crisis, which has reintroduced the language of sovereignty and territorial sovereignty in Ireland in the last 2 years. And now we have a looming border crisis ahead, right? So these are the phrases that have, in a way, defined contemporary Ireland. And all these phrases, as you can tell, are crisis-ridden. But I think in the midst of all of these crises, there is one that touches aspects of all the others, and one that I think until very recently received very little attention. Okay, so I want to kind of share with you one of the headlines from the Irish Times today. White Irish people have never had to think about this, thinking about race and racism in Ireland. And as you can see from the timestamp or the date stamp, this is from today's Irish Times. So I'm, of course, here speaking of the crisis of race studies, and racism in Ireland. And I know that, questions, as I was saying, of biracial, multiracial Irish heritages have already been broached here. But, unlike Dan Kennedy's talk, my talk is very far less personal, but I'm happy to answer questions about my own Indian background and my interest in Ireland. So, but I want to give you a wider perspective on this important topic today. So in a speech, delivered to an American audience, I think at the University of California in 1906, right, the famous Irish scholar nationalist Douglas Hyde made a striking comparison, between Irish people, enslaved Africans, and other dispossessed people of empire, of the British Empire. He was, criticizing the British colonial system of education and its dire effects in Ireland. And he said, Irish were people who once took delight in intellectual debate in the Irish language and in literature. But they had now become, and I quote from Hyde, like Negroes or castaways who were, quote, absolutely ignorant of their own past. Analogies like this, of course, are always tricky, and Hyde's rhetoric was only meant to highlight the absurdity of the comparison, right? The Irish, of course, stood apart from enslaved peoples and hapless migrants. On the contrary, Hyde said, they, meaning Irish people, boast perhaps the broadest race heritage in Europe. They are the descendants of a stock to which almost every country in Western Europe owes, and frankly acknowledges that it owes a debt of lasting gratitude. Hyde claimed, that unlike enslaved people who had forgotten or perhaps were made to forget their history, the Irish were not and I quote, a race of nobodies or of slaves, or a, quote, a people without a past. So what we have here, and obviously Hyde is somebody we all look up to for very good reason. But what we have here in Hyde's rhetoric is perhaps the unwitting kind of replaying of the very violence of imperial discourse that he was critiquing by relying on basically the dehumanization of the Black body as normal, right? enslaved people in America as being without culture and history are kind of a given in Hyde's rhetoric. So this in itself was not the first instance of such a kind of a problematic comparison, you know, between the Irish subject of empire and the African subject of the slave trade, right? Some of you will, of course, know Thomas Carlyle's very infamous piece, almost a half century before Hyde's writing, that kind of compared Britain's Caribbean colonies and plantations to Ireland, and he called these Caribbean plantations, quote, Negro Ireland and, quote, a Black Ireland, in this infamous essay, Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question. So writing to challenge the anti-slavery movement, Carlyle, among other assertions, rationalized, you know, the slave trade in the same vein that colonization was politically, financially, culturally normalized, I would say, in that century. One of the more recent examples of these kind of comparisons between African Americans and the Irish. Recent examples would obviously come from the Irish film The Commitments, based on Roddy Doyle's very famous 1987 novel of the same name. And they also speak to the continuation of this theme. In a particularly poignant scene from that film, this is a very well-known piece, I'm sure familiar to all of you, Jimmy Rabbit is insisting that his newly formed band play soul music in an effort to imitate the quote-unquote working man's rhythm. So let's just kind of watch that briefly, and I hope you can all see it and hear it.
That's what you got to measure up to, lads. Do you not think, what? Well, like, maybe we're a little white for that kind of thing. Do you not get it, lads? The Irish are the blacks of Europe, and Dubliners are the blacks of Ireland, and the Northside Dubliners are the blacks of Dublin. So say it once, say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud.
Right. So, so it's kind of it's kind of a bizarre little comparison, right? Kind of doubling back on the irony. And remember, this particular novel, The Commitments, was written at a time when Ireland was experiencing the aftershocks of a severe recession from the previous decade. And such an analogy, you know, that the Irish were the blacks of Europe, in a way kind of made sense in terms of the scale of economic stagnation and destitution in the country. But it also produced a mirthful response. You know, it's a kind of a, that's why people laugh at this particular scene, because the comparison is anomalous, right? The Irish are not black. You know, the histories are not the same. So, as the examples above testify, you know, the question of race in Irish literature and culture has always been an intersectional one. I think, you know, it's entangled with concerns of class, economics, empire. And all of these illusions are problematic, especially when they are uttered by Irish voices, right? It's like a cultural doubling is happening, you know, so that Irishness can be comprehended via its similarity or evident disparity from blackness. What's interesting is that it is not only historically relevant, I would say, it's actually also relevant to the economic boom and bust narrative of contemporary Ireland. This particular narrative of blackness and Irishness, right? And I'll return to this later on. So from my perspective, you know, it seems imperative that anybody interested in Ireland or Irish studies should turn to questions of race and the multifaceted issues that arise from it. And I feel it should not be doing so by perpetuating an uncritical identification with people of color. This seems to have been the unfortunate legacy, obviously, of a historical racialization of the Irish people, right? And it's from an old, you know, formula for good reason. The Irish as the Simeonized underclass that threatened the white Caucasian race from within, right? So the Irish in colonial rhetoric were white, but not quite, right? They were Simianized. They were closer to their bestial brothers, the apes. This is, of course, true in relation to all of these narratives that existed, right? Pseudo-ethnography, you know, all of these kind of things that were happening in the 18th, 19th century. But I think now there is an urgent need to recognize and come to terms with the inherent whiteness of Ireland and Irishness, whose soft violence is evident, I think, in everyday discourse and whose tragic consequences are amply clear in Irish-American politics today. So we may need to rethink the way in which we read Douglas Hyde's proclamation that the Irish were neither Negroes nor mongrels nor castaways. If we are reading our contemporary moment in the wake of Trump, it is towards the castaways and mongrels that our energies, I think, should be directed. Writing, in 2004, some of you might be interested in this book, Steve Gardner's book. He noted, that the theme of race in Irish history has been approached only from one direction, which is like the Irish were Simianized, the Irish were historically racialized by the English. In 2009, John Brannigan, in his book, Race in Modern Irish Literature and Culture, reasserted this claim, and said that racial ideologies and racist practices have not only ungirded the Irish state and its defining cultural institution and policies, often in muted and insidious forms, but have been central to the ways in which official discourses of Irishness have been negotiated and contested in the cultural sphere. So I think, John is one of the first scholars really to really centralize this idea. This is not an ancillary concern of Irish literature and culture. It is absolutely central to questions of citizenship, absolutely central to questions of statehood. And we can all see all of this playing out today. Are you all with me, by the way, or is it too many words? I'm getting tired of my own voice, Okay. So I want to give you another set of kind of examples. And these examples really come from the 18th century with the rise of antiquarianism in Ireland. And antiquarians and Orientalists were basically trying to find an alternative genealogy for Irish people, one that was not connected to Britain, right? So a lot of us will know, like old Irish words for king, like ri, were suddenly etymologically being transcribed as connected to the Sanskrit Raja, not the Latinx Rex, for example, right? So there were all of these theories saying the Irish were connected to the Orientals, to the Phoenicians, to the Milesians, etc. So these are the kind of alternative theories of Irish origin. The Milesian derived from rich medieval Irish sources, which posited Scythian, Egyptian, and Spanish ancestry, mirroring the various sojourns of the Irish on their lengthy journey to the promised land of Ireland. And the Scandinavian, which was much less exotic and not mythologized, and propounded by the upholders of the rightness of colonization from England, aiming to place that colonization in a framework of pre-existing contact with an invasion by the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe. What's interesting is all of these debates about these alternative origins was also inflected by the modern imperial project and by the concomitant fascination with the Orient, by which the Irish and their language could be seen as relics of an ancient civilization, linking England's oldest colony, Ireland, with its newest, India. And these words are Claire Carroll's, and this is the essay she's been writing for my book that is coming out in the next few years. So suddenly then Ireland and India became this incredible kind of comparative framework. And there are lots of examples of scholarly studies that have been done since then. So here is one example, an essay. I have an essay in this book. This came out in the early 2000s, right? Published by Irish Academic Press, I think, Ireland and India. This here is another one, right? And of course, we also have a very famous now special issue of History Ireland on Ireland and India as well. Right. So all of these vibrant connections between these two countries, and of course, you know, India was the jewel in the crown, a really important, what do you call it, colony of Britain, and Ireland, of course, was the Emerald Isle, the other very important colony, the first colony of Britain. So they held these kind of two really important kind of comparative frames. And so all of these kind of examples, you know, of these Oriental kind of lineages, you find a lot of in the writings of W.B. Yeats, especially if you think of Yeats's early poetry, but also throughout his entire kind of life. India and Indian philosophy and Indian history return time and time again. Joyce as well is another writer who continually references the Orient, so to speak, right? Araby, of course, we know the short story from Dubliners, very famous short story that deals with Joyce's Orientalism. But Joyce is also kind of, in a way, trying to think beyond these, right, these misconceptions of otherness. And he's also pushing towards kind of multifaceted Irish lineages. In one of his essays, he writes, "In the present nation, it would be impossible to exclude all those who are descended from foreign families." So Joyce is one of the first kind of Celtic post-revivalist thinkers who's actually questioning these origin myths. He's actually saying, look, we have actually descended from a number of different peoples. Here's an example from Ulysses, some of you will be familiar with. This is, you know, Bloom in the Calypso episode in Ulysses. Bloom is kind of suddenly lost in an Eastern reverie. And Bloom is thinking to himself, what might it be like to be in the Orient? Walk along a strand, strange land, come to a city gate, sentry there, wander through awned streets, turbaned faces going by, dark caves of carpet shops, big man, Turco the Terrible, seated cross-legged, smoking a coiled pipe. Cries of sellers in the streets, drink water scented with fennel, sherbet. Dander along all day. Might meet a robber or two. Well, meet him. Getting on to sundown, the shadows of the mosques among the pillars, priest with a scroll rolled up, a shiver of the trees, signal the evening wind, I pass on. Fading gold sky. A mother watches me from her doorway. She calls her children home in their dark language. High wall, beyond strings twanged. Night sky, moon, violet, color of Molly's new garters. Strings. Listen, a girl playing one of those instruments, what do you call them? Dulcimers. I pass. In this kind of episode, Bloom is certainly very much in the middle of Dublin, but he kind of almost takes a kind of a mental journey to this incredible land of the Orient. Joyce here is, of course, recreating in like a cinematographic style, you know, this kind of etherealness of the Orient, and he begins to kind of question that through Bloom. Bloom begins to say to himself, that's not really like what the Orient truly is. That's kind of completely all made up, you know. So Joyce is kind of beginning to critique all of these Orientalisms. So one way I would say to kind of take a step back, because I'm just kind of zooming through decades of history and culture here, skipping along very merrily. One way to think about race in Irish literature and culture would be to kind of think about people like the anti-colonial imaginations of scholars like Hyde or the revivalist writings. You know, even Synge in his essays on the Aran Islands, he describes the dresses of the women of Aran Islands as being Eastern, right? If you go back and read the essays of Synge, you will find that actually they're all being compared to Eastern women. Another way to think about the question of race would be to trace questions of Irishness circulating in the network of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And this is something a lot of you will probably be familiar with. This is a picture from St. Patrick's Day in Montserrat. A recent New Yorker article actually also talks about it. Ireland, Northern Ireland, and some parts of Canada, parts of the USA, and Montserrat are the only places in the world that recognize St. Patrick's Day. But also St. Patrick's Day as a public holiday, which is not the case in America. And we know, the Irish were some of Montserrat's earliest settlers. And on St. Patrick's Day in 1768, the African slaves on the island planned an uprising that failed. 9 slaves were hanged, right? And St. Patrick's now has become a 10-day festival to honor that rebellion, to celebrate the island's history, to contend with the lasting Irish influence, and to invest, obviously, in the country's future. What is often forgotten, of course, is that, these enslaved bodies were brought to Montserrat by Irish slave traders, They did not become Africans did not become the largest group until the 18th century. And why then? Because of the economic dependence on sugar at the time. So there were thousands of Irish and Scottish captives, of course. Some of them were indentured laborers, but a lot of them were also slave owners. And this history, there's kind of a lot of archival material here. I just have 2 more minutes, so maybe I'll just end, Ida, but I can kind of go on and talk about other things. You'll just have to guide me. I'm happy to keep talking, So, okay, so I'll keep going for a little bit longer. So the, question of enslaving people was quite prominent, in 18th century intellectual life in Ireland. For example, here is Olava Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Olava Equiano, a former slave who won his freedom and then traveled in the British Isles. And his book was a bestseller, actually, in Ireland for a long time. Another one, of course, is the famous figure of Frederick Douglass, right? And just on that point, I thought some of you might be interested. You might already know this, but some of you might be interested in this particular program that's coming up, being organized by Georgetown on the 29th of September. And it's about Frederick Douglass in Ireland, a conversation about history, solidarity, racial justice in Ireland and the US. And all you can do is basically just search the web, agitate Frederick Douglass in Ireland, and you'll get the Zoom link. I think you'll have to register before you can participate. Anyway, so another famous example would be Frederick Douglass's visit to Ireland, of course, and we know the novels that have been written about that, right? And so the narrative about Frederick Douglass, I think I find quite interesting, because this is the letter that gets republished often, a very important letter. And after having spent a while in Ireland, traveling, he went to numerous places. He was leaving Belfast to head off to Scotland. He writes, "My dear friend Garrison, I am now about to take leave of the Emerald Isle for Glasgow, Scotland. I've been here a little more than 4 months. I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life." And then he kind of goes on and talks about the warm and generous cooperation extended to him by the Irish people, the glorious enthusiasm with which thousands have flocked to hear the story of enslaved people from his country. So Douglass was wonderfully received, obviously met the liberator and all of that. But what that happened, how that emerges now in public consciousness is this kind of self-congratulatory rhetoric of Irish liberalism, right? The Irish were the ones who welcomed Frederick Douglass. How could any Irish people or actors actually be in any way racially motivated? But what's interesting is, at the same time, while we congratulate ourselves about our reception of Douglas, we also kind of deny forms of citizenship that are actually Black. I'll talk about that in a second. Let's see. Yeah. You know, I would say the contemporary moment offers us an exceptional vantage point to kind of think about these questions of citizenship and race in Ireland. The reason is because this is a unique moment in the history of Ireland, and it's partly because of the growing crescendo of cultural identification by a biracial population within Ireland, right? We Are Irish claims this new demographic of Black Irish people, and it seems that the voting public in Ireland largely agrees, right? Irish people, once deemed as the Blacks of Europe, finally attaining whiteness in distant parts of empire, including America, are suddenly kind of beginning to realize their own whiteness. At the same time, the racial politics of Irishness take on a very different hue in the United States. The 2016 elections obviously saw the rise of Trumpian racist nationalism and a growing confidence in white supremacist ideologies. And these movements have been forcefully linked to people of Irish heritage in the US, right? This fact led to the annual Irish Stand event gathering in New York, for example, organized by Glucksman Ireland House. The unexpected victory of Trump entailed a swift and cogent response, if you will remember, by Irish politicians who noted that the role of Irish Americans in the outcome of the election could not be overlooked, right? In a speech which, quote unquote, went viral in November 2016, Senator Aon O'Riordan proclaimed, "We were the Muslims once, we were the Mexicans," thus bringing into play, you know, all of these kind of entrenched rhetorics of religious and cultural division. But around the same time, the internet kind of began to bristle with the return of these memes that kept talking about white Irish slaves. It kind of began originally in 2008 and was endlessly recirculated since. History Ireland, the notable journal, also brought out a kind of a special issue on this idea of Irish slavery, pointing out this particular essay that was written by John Graham, where were there Irish slaves in Barbados? And History Ireland said he claimed that there were Irish slaves in Barbados in the mid-17th century, and that refusing to call them slaves is quibbling. Such statements are part of a larger and growing public sentiment that unequivocally declares the experiences of the Irish in Barbados to be those of slavery. In contrast, scholars of the period agree that those who were forcibly deported from Britain and Ireland to the Caribbean in the mid-17th century cannot be accurately described simply as slaves, but as indentured servants. There's a common narrative that obviously you will all be familiar with, was that the Irish were enslaved and they now have access to power. Why can't Black Americans do the same? But of course, that was in itself a motive of extreme right-wing politics. So that's happening. I want you to kind of take a step back and think about the recent liberal secular discourse in post-Celtic Tiger Ireland, right? Ireland seems to be, as the New York Times article described it, intent on bucking the illiberal tide in the West at a time of, you know, climate crisis, at a time when the seas are rising. It is understandable why questions of nations, questions of borders and walls have become resurgent, right? This is true of most of Europe. This is true also, of course, of America as well. Not so in Ireland, actually, where questions of birthright citizenship is coming back again. Now, some of you might remember 2004 was the year when the referendum on citizenship was passed in Ireland with resounding backing, which in a way denied a lot of migrant workers and refugees and asylum seekers to actually claim Irish citizenship. Now that is radically changing as well. So here's another, therefore, another kind of rhetoric about otherness and blackness, especially in Ireland. Finally, what is becoming evident today is a lack of basic racial literacy when it comes to Ireland. Here's an example of police bias in Ireland, which often gets unnoticed. When I was younger, I used to think the whole of Ireland was hateful, notes Lawson Mapane, a 27-year-old stylist from Castleknock, who agrees that racism is an issue within An Garda Síochána. I've seen it firsthand. You're in a group of lads walking and they'll stop you to ask, where are you going? Where do you live? I've had friends who were searched by Gardaí for no reason. I even dress a certain way so the guards don't stop me. I rarely wear hoodies or tracksuit bottoms because I know it means I'm more likely to be stopped. It makes me really frustrated and disillusioned with the guards and justice system. Racism in Ireland ranges from overtly extreme and being called the N-word to subtle things like you're very educated for a black person or you are very articulate. What's kind of bizarre is that some of these kids obviously have only known Ireland. They've grown up in Ireland and they've actually never heard the N-word until they're called it, and then they often go back to their parents and wonder, what does that word mean? I've just been called that twice today, you know, and there are a lot of these accounts actually that keep coming up as well. Kids who've never grown up with the language like they might have if they had grown up in the States, suddenly being kind of faced with it. Direct provision system and also kind of brought a lot of these issues to the fore. But what becomes very clear actually is that there is a basic lack of racial literacy happening. And if you look at headlines from numerous kind of news sources in Ireland, you will find a kind of similar note being struck as this slide demonstrates. I won't talk about this direct provision system. I can certainly do so during the Q&A. One thing to do note is that although there is this liberalism on the rise in Ireland, if you look at the application for the Irish passport, you'd be very hard pressed to find a single black face, right? Or indeed a person of color. I think the image on the right there is trying hard to show some kind of biracial commentary, but it certainly isn't clear. Finally, God, there's so much more I could talk about COVID and race in Ireland, actually, which we can do during the Q&A. But I want to finish maybe with Imelda May's very famous kind of narrative that was, I think, only came out a few months ago, right? In the wake of the George Floyd protests, I think. So let's just let Imelda May have the final word, and I'm happy to take Q&A after that. Oh, sorry.
You don't get to be racist and Irish. You don't get to be proud of your heritage, plights, and fights for freedom while kneeling on the neck of another. You're not entitled to sing songs of heroes and martyrs, mothers and fathers who cried as they starved in a famine, or of brave-hearted, soft-spoken poets and artists lined up in a yard, blindfolded and bound while waiting for Godot or point blank to sound. We immigrated. We took refuge and so cannot refuse when it's our time to return the favour. Land stolen, spirits broken, bodies crushed and swollen, unholy tokens of Christ nailed to a tree. You hang round your neck like the noose of the free. Our colour pasty, our accents thick, hands like shovels from mortar and bricklay in every foundation of the cities you stand upon. Our suffering seeps from every stone your opportunities arise from. Outstanding on the shoulders of your forefathers and foremothers who bore your mother's mother. Our music is for the righteous. Our joys are earned and well-deserved and serve to remind us to remember more blacks, more dogs, more Irish. still labelled leprechauns, micks, paddies, louts. We're shouting to tell you our land, our laws are progressively out there. We're in a chrysalis state of emerging into a new and more beautiful era, 40 shades better. Unanimous in our rainbow vote, we've found our stereotypical pot of gold, and my God, it's good. So join us, because you don't get to be racist and Irish.
Okay, let's stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. And maybe take a minute or two. I don't know if you...
This is Bill.
Malcolm, sorry, can I just say how we plan to do this, Bill, before you come through? Jonathan is going to be the person. Me, Tim? Hi, Jonathan is going to be the person to moderate the question. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat section, and Jonathan then will be the one to pose the question to Malcolm, rather than having all the voices come through. So if you have a question now, just take a moment and type it into the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And Jonathan will be the one to put the question to Malcolm. Malcolm, thank you so much. Bear with us.
Hello, Malcolm. We have one question right away.
Okay.
John is wondering if you could please speak to the common phrase in Jamaica, the Black Irish of Jamaica. I taught school in Jamaica many years ago. The blackest student in one of my classes was Patrick Murphy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are a number of historians who are kind of working on the Caribbean overall, and really far better authorities than myself, but they are really descendants of both Irish indentured laborers and also some Irish slave owners, right? So they carry their Irish heritage, you know, very, very proudly, I would say. And there are two histories to the phrase Black Irish. One is, yes, the Irish in the Caribbean, or biracial people actually of Irish descent in the Caribbean with Irish names, for example. We don't really hear much about the brown Irish, for example, although there is a substantial number of brown Irish people in India, where I come from. If you look at some of the surnames of people there, the O'Briens, right, for example, feature quite often in the Anglo-Irish constituency, sorry, the Anglo-Indian constituency in India. But another phrase, the Black Irish, is a more contemporary kind of usage, which comes to us in the wake of the Cheddarmen from Britain. You know, this archaeological evidence of one of the oldest inhabitants of Britain, and the archaeological evidence from one of the oldest inhabitants of Ireland seem to be suggesting that originally Irish people were much, much darker than they are today. Right, and it is only of centuries and millennia of the Irish weather that in a way lightens the skin. But, you know, yeah, I think a lot of Jamaican names have Irish surnames. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If anyone has another question, you're welcome to pop it into the chat here.
I see somebody's asking about the Douglas event, so I'm going to try and get that for you.
I believe I did find that and put it into the chat.
Oh, did you? Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. And I also put the link to Imelda May's video there on the chat as well. Sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Bill had a question, but Bill, have you been able to put it into the chat? Have you been able to type your question in the chat?
He's muted.
Well, Bill works on that. Marianne says, my great aunt talked of the Black Irish and told me when I was a young girl that it meant the person had black hair and dark skin, not red and pale skin. She'd say they were of the oldest bloodline.
Yeah, I mean, Ida, you probably know about this as well, right? The red hair thing, and that is true. I think I've heard Katrin, my wife, talk about this as well. Actually, I should have said that. Yes, there used to be the Black Irish in that sense, I suppose. Talking about kind of genetic heritage, you know, did you come from Spain or was it another bloodline, right? I think, yeah, that's...
The Armada. I think the Armada was meant to have run aground off the west coast, and therefore some folks are of the view that the Galway girl with the dark hair, dark looks, was because some of the sailors from the Armada came in there in the west of Ireland. So I've heard that theory as well.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of beginning of the theory, right? That they came from, yeah. So we've been searching, my daughters and I have been searching for the Lost Armada for the last, I don't know, number of years. Every year we go back in the summer, not this year. We keep going to all the sites where it has been spotted, but we never find it. So this is, the whole thing might be completely fictional, of course, but yeah.
Well, if you do happen to find it, please let us know.
Yeah.
Malcolm, you mentioned a regrettable historic ignorance among Irish citizens about their own country's racial history, which is something Americans have in common with them. Is there a project similar to the 1619 project in Ireland?
I think, you know, that's a great question. Thank you, Jonathan. I think there isn't one in the offing, but I think that is exactly the kind of work that new institutions like MOLI, for example, the Museum of Literature in Ireland, is kind of trying to do. I think the conversation about race is becoming much more nuanced, as it should be, and it's also kind of becoming much more common, as it should be as well. I've lived in Ireland for 15 years, right? I went there in the year 2000, and maybe this example might answer to where the trajectory is headed. I don't know of a project right now, but I'm presuming something like this will be done. And my book is just one attempt to enter this conversation, right? It begins all the way in the 17th century, all the way up to the 16th century, and all the way up to the present. But anyway, I moved to Ireland at a time when people were beginning to move to Ireland because of the Celtic Tiger. And what really surprised me was that at the one hand, I felt a lot of solidarity with people. I had some incredible friends. And on the other, I was always the outsider. And whenever I talked about certain incidents to people, they would, you know, brush it off. They'd be like, "Oh God, you know, that was just not really, it wasn't meant. You know, he wasn't thinking he had a drink taken or whatever." So there was no conversation, and that I felt it was quite stifling. I mean, the reason why I wear glasses, for example, is because of literally a racist attack in the middle of Ranelagh at 7 o'clock in the evening, and nobody helped me. I almost lost my left eyesight, and my eyesight was affected, but people wouldn't talk. And the 2004 referendum, in a way, proved that people were unwilling to talk about race, really. And what I take great comfort in is that when I go back to Ireland now, the conversations are far more rigorous, and people are taking the question of race and their own whiteness very, very seriously, right? This continuing conversation about, oh no, the Irish are not white, in a way disavows the incredible leeway that a lot of Irish people get because of their color of their skin, right? So numerous incidents happened, actually, to me personally between 2000 and 2015, including being attacked on a train that was video recorded, and the Gardaí basically wouldn't take that case, right? Even when I walked up to the Gardaí, they just would not. They would be like, yeah. I said, we have video evidence of this. They'd be like, yeah, but the guy could also kind of, counter sue you. that kind of narrative, and that happened a lot. It also was directed against my wife, Catherine, who is an Irish dub, right? And so she was called names if you were walking down the street, all of that. But I think a lot of those conversations now are actually being challenged too, right? Or the lack of conversation actually is being challenged, and people are more and more familiar with the importance of the race question in Ireland today. And I wouldn't be surprised actually if a project like that, and I think I will mention this to Margaret Kelleher, you know, your great example, right? I said, well, this is the next big project, maybe of the RIA, maybe of UCD, maybe of MOLI, but certainly I think more and more people are writing about it, you know. And actually there's a lot of music that's actually responding to this as well. The Sangano family, for example, Jonathan, might interest you. The couple of rap bands, for example, you know, that you probably heard of, have you? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a very interesting group in Belfast called Kneecap.
Mm.
And they almost always just rap in Irish. So, and some of it is, you know, meant to be funny, and some of it is meant to be quite serious, and it kind of spans the spectrum, but
yes. You also have the Guilfoyle brothers in Limerick. I don't know if you know them, right? They've been doing this for years between Indian classical and Irish music, Irish trad. Yeah.
I did hear a little of that. Yeah, it's some nice work, some nice stuff there. Malcolm, we do have another, if you don't mind, another question or two. So what has surprised you during your research for this book on race in Irish literature and culture? And also, if you can dovetail in, the role of leadership in facilitating the discussion on race, where is it at present in Ireland? Two different questions, but.
Yeah, I think, you know, a dangerous phenomena happened around about the mid-2000s, and that was an invention of this phrase, the New Irish, although people did not necessarily mean it in the way it came across. I think there was a kind of an attached violence to it, right? So I'm going to make this question as personal as I can, because it might be kind of more interesting that way, I suppose. Because I don't think there are hard and fast answers to those questions, all great ones. So I think one of the things that the New Irish phraseology did was that it basically made people believe that they actually had to assimilate and kind of had to adopt this assimilationist narrative, right? I remember I used to do a lot of radio essays for RTE when I was in Dublin, and one of the radio essays I did, actually, in a way, I was trying to adopt this phrase, New Irish. I was asked on air, would you consider yourself as New Irish? And, you know, I uncritically said, yeah, I suppose I would. Although I make it very clear now today that I am not Irish. I have, in a way, no Irish heritage whatsoever, but I do have a wife who is Irish. My children are Irish and Indian, and I've lived in Ireland, and my subject area of research is Ireland, right? So that should give me enough material to talk about Ireland. So I think one of the questions of leadership and who is speaking about it, I think, is actually emerging from maybe people like myself, but also I would say the younger generation as well. I think people who are in their 20s and living in Ireland are far better at speaking about Irishness and Blackness than anybody else, right? And of course, we have some incredible organizations working not only for asylum and seekers and refugees, but actually also multicultural Ireland as well. So examples of this would be, you know, if you were to look up a list of podcasts from Ireland that are being hosted by people of color, will actually give you a pulse on the kind of conversation that's happening. And I think politics is far behind this cultural maneuver. And I think that's where we should be looking. We really should be looking towards the 20, 25-year-olds because they have, in a way, the language and the lived experience to kind of talk about it in very authoritative ways, I would say. So things that were surprising. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to find the depth of research that still needs to be done in relation to the Caribbean and Jamaica, all of those places, right? I'm still surprised. It's not really my area of study, but I think there's a wealth of information that still needs to be unearthed.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any further questions? You're certainly welcome to pop them into the chat.
I'm wondering if Bill wants to actually say his question, if he hasn't managed the chat function. Bill.
He'll be back in a second. I tried to type something in and I don't know how to make it go over to Jonathan. You got two Luddites over here, so I don't know. I typed a question in, but I don't know how to get it to Jonathan.
Well, would you like to, just while you're here live, just say your question?
All right. Well, this is a silly one. I'm sure Bill's was more cerebral, but what is the history of the Irish in taking slaves to Ireland, for example, St. Patrick? That always threw me when I learned that for the very first time, that St. Patrick was a slave brought to Ireland and escaped and then came back. So how many times did the Irish go out and bring people back to Ireland as slaves?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There are all of these kind of early modern and, prehistorical accounts, obviously, as well. The only difference I would say would be that, the slavery practice at the time of the Roman Empire, let's say, is not the same kind of slavery that is being practiced in the midst of the rise of capitalism. They're kind of radically different forms of slavery. I don't really have an answer to that question, Kathleen, to be honest. The phrase, St. Patrick being a slave, of course, yes, that has been used, and there were, we know a few things. We know that, it was the Stuarts who introduced the slave trade in Ireland. We also know that when, Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, it was becoming increasingly clear that sugar was the way to go when it comes to economic profit, and a lot of Irish people were actually recruited for this kind of plantation business. So we can pinpoint to 1660, but whether we can pinpoint to St. Patrick as one of the origins of the Irish slave narrative, I'm not sure I can do that, partly because the historical conditions are so different, in pre-modern medieval times, and they bear very little resemblance to the incredible capitalist network that forms under empire. So bodies can become, tabulated, catalogued, and they can become property. So we have to kind of think about slavery in relation to the growth of property rights, right? And that really doesn't happen until much later in the history of kind of European capitalism, I would say. So I agree, Kathleen, but I think maybe two different narratives there, There's some incredible essays that are being written actually for my book, and one of them actually does talk about Patrick and kind of how to think about these phrases, this language, but surely, yeah, medieval history is quite different, I would say, from the kind of history I'm trying to chart here. Ida says, wind up to you, Jonathan.
Now, who should I wind up, Ida? We can get people wound up, well, thank you very much, Malcolm. I suppose, would this be the appropriate time to get some music in front of the screen for a few minutes, or would you like to?
We were going to transition just to that, if I can just again go back to the program. Jonathan, one moment. Malcolm, first of all, thank you so much. Very layered and complex presentation that you've provided us. And I think it will require some unpacking. So I'm delighted that Tim has had the good sense to record this so we can go back to it and work on it. And on a personal level, I want to acknowledge how it hurts me deeply to know that you have experienced acts of violence on the street of Dublin. I have to tell you, it just breaks my heart. And yet I must also take responsibility. And we must all take responsibility for what happens on our streets, be it here in Amherst or on the streets of Dublin. So I think when you're acknowledging that we have a lot of work to do in terms of educating ourselves, it's only through that work, and I think taking action, that we can own our streets and make sure that you and your family don't experience such acts, and just to acknowledge that.
Oh, thank you, Ida. There was no need, but thank you so much. Yeah, it's a story that has not been told often, and people are only beginning to tell them now. So I think that's good.
Well, I think I understand it as a woman who feels unsafe on city streets at night. I know that threat of violence. I know it as a lesbian woman. I've experienced that violence, but it's always an indicator of where the mass of folk in the society are actually coming into knowing.
Yes.
I often take it as almost like on the cusp of change. These acts become part of the public, rather than something that happens hidden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. We've loads to go with. I want to acknowledge once again your incredible work in this area, and your 2 books forthcoming next year and the year after, your edited collection. We'll put all that up on our.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you.
And Jonathan and Amanda have very kindly organised some musicians. If you'd like to sit and listen, that'd be fantastic. They're great musicians. They call themselves Lakela together, which is not such a bad ending to a conversation that has exposed the divisions amongst us and how we need to address them because of difference and othering. So, Gura Mila Mahagat, Malcolm. And
thank you, Ida. Thank you, everybody. Sure. Jonathan, I hope I'll be able to catch this on YouTube, but I have 2 daughters to take care of because Catherine's off. So I'm in my office and I'll be driving straight off back home to look after them. So I hope you don't mind me just nipping out.
Not at all. Gurumila Magat, Malcolm, thank you so very much again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Slán.
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 Right, folks. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, if Tim could let me into the meeting, or who's ever in charge, I'm transferring this to my phone, and the musicians are right here, so they're going to be playing tunes, and I'll just pop out for a few moments, and you can have a little bit of music, and then I'll come back. All right. I can still hear you, so if you want me to...
for tea. We can make a cup of tea for ourselves.
Absolutely, you can make a cup of tea for yourselves. And I can still hear you. I'll be connected this way. So Ida, if you just want to interrupt and talk to me when we want to wrap up.
And Ida, don't forget the scones.
I only wish.
We miss you. We miss the meetings. We miss you guys very much.
We do.
Jonathan's wearing his coat.
Oh. So, Bill wants to know, Jonathan, are you wearing your kilt?
Always, always. I've got my kilt and I've got a nice hat on. We're going for all the style points today. As my sister says, I have to fly my colors like a peacock all the time.
Have to find what?
Find my colors.
All right, folks. I'll be right with you. Just 1 second now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
So one of the things we should be aware of is that our next session in October is the Margaret Marr Award, and we're doing it slightly differently this year. And Tim, do you want to say a few words about the Margaret Marr Award?
Where is he? You're telling me he's on.
Sure. So what we decided to do this year, which was different than previous years, is we wanted to take the opportunity to single out and award someone for their contributions to Irish culture, Irish music, and so on in the area, and make people aware of that contribution. And so we're going to present an award to Rosie Kane in October, rather than have the competition that we've had in the past. Rosie's kindly agreed to receive the honor. So we're going to present her virtually an award. She'll actually physically get the award. But in any case, we'll do a virtual awards presentation in October. And she's going to do a presentation, I believe, at that time also. Yes?
Thanks, Tim.
Tim, if you don't, oh, thank you very much. All
Yep,
right, here we
you're
go.
in.
Sorry, I couldn't come up with something. Hi, everybody. Hi. We're just gonna play some tunes for y'all. We have scones in your honor. No tea, it's too warm for tea, but
Hope everybody's doing okay in
Yeah.
this crazy time. What do we got?
Play that good tune that you know.
That good tune.
Just did.
Yeah, reels. Oh my goodness. A reel.
No, it does. No, it doesn't.
Virginia, sure. And whatever comes after it.
Oh, wonderful.
Great pipes.
What is that?
Ladies' pantalettes.
It's the Longford Collector. Not Garrett Berry's.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and thanks to all these fine people.
This is how it works.
This is how we do things here in Montague. Anyway. So, thank you very much, and we are all thinking of you, drinking, well, eating scones and drinking iced tea anyway.
Drinking scones and eating tea.
Eating tea and drinking scones.
Whoops. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you doing that for us.
Tell
Sure,
Amanda,
you're welcome.
tell
Thank you.
Amanda she had me dancing around the kitchen.
Did the sound come out okay?
Absolutely.
Yes, great.
It sounds like we're on your porch.
Oh, great. That was the intention.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so very much, folks. I believe it's Aegis' turn, or Tim or Sam, or one of my betters, but thank you very much for tuning in.
We about ready, Ida?
All right, folks. We're about to wrap it up there. I want to end with buíochas, with the word of thanks to all of you for making the effort and for bearing with us. Hello, Anne Jean's family, the two girls, lovely to see. Fáilte. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for your patience with us. There's Shawneen. Oh, and Peg. And just to say, we'll get better at this. It'll be seamless. But the music is gorgeous, Shonacon. Gurmila Mahagud.
Indeed.
But I'm off good.
All right. So next October, it's next month. It's Rosie Keane, a tribute to Rosie Keane, our first recipient of the Margaret Marr Award. One of our musicians, one of our regular musicians, Al Ladd, is creating a special award in honor of Rosie's contribution to our community over the years as a musician and a composer. And there'll be several people doing a few tributes to Rosie. So that's it from me. Anything from the committee? Sam, are you all right?
The committee.
You got a cup of tea, me too. Okay. From us to you, Toga boge, as they say. Take it easy. Take it
Bye
happy.
now, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
There's one very simple Irish word you can all learn is slán. Slán. Bye. Slán. And if you want to go really adventurous, slán go fóil. Just bye for a while. Slán go fóil. All right. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Signing off. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.